Awesome. Okay, great. Well, hello, everybody. And it's good to see you for our second week of class. I really enjoyed reading your discussion posts and seeing how you were beginning to make sense of translanguaging. Some of you for the first time, some of you after having been exposed to this term or concept in previous classes. So I'm excited to dive into this with you today. And I will start with sharing my screen. That will not work. I think I have to hit share. There we go. Okay, can everybody see that okay? Yep, okay, awesome. And slideshow. Okay, great. So today we're going to do a few different things. The focus for this week is on the translanguaging stance and what it means to develop a translanguaging stance. We are going to start with some review though from week one. So in a moment, I'm going to send us off to a Padlet for you to drop a definition or a quote or something, an image that answers the question, what is translanguaging? From kind of how you've been engaging with it thus far from week one. And then I wanted to spend a little bit of time together just going over some key concepts because you were introduced to a lot of new terms. So I want to give you a chance to ask questions if you have any from about ideas in the readings, and then kind of define some of these concepts together so that you have those shared definitions as we move forward. After that, I'm going to put you into small groups and I'll give you a chance to share your identity text with one another. I may need to take a moment to make some of you co-hosts, I think, so you can share your screens. I'll have to figure that out, but we'll share those. And then we will spend the last part of class talking about this week, week two. We'll talk about the content that you will engage with or maybe have already begun to engage with. And then the assignments connected to this week. And you can see here kind of specific things that are embedded in this week are translanguaging stance, thinking about language and power, and then the linguistic landscapes project. All right, so that is where we're headed. Before I jump in, any questions, announcements? Any exciting news going on? Okay, I will also open up my chat. So throughout class, I don't always do a great job of this, but I will try to keep an eye on that. So as questions come up or as things come up, always know that you, at any moment during these virtual classes, you can unmute and say something, and also feel free to drop things in the chat. I know we're a big group, so if that's easier, you're always also welcome to do that. Okay, so we're going to start with our warm-up. So I'm going to take us to Padlink. Let me Padlet. So I'm going to drop this in the chat in a moment. Is anybody not familiar with Padlet? Maybe give me a show of hands if you've never seen Padlet before. No hands. Everyone's used Padlet before? Ugh, the post-COVID world that we live in, it is a is it a wonderful thing? I'm glad to hear you know it though. Yes. So in a moment, I'll drop this link in the chat. Remember, you can click anywhere or you can use this plus sign in the corner. So please create a little window and then add a definition to define translanguaging as you currently understand it. Feel free to go into your readings and pull out a quote. You can type up the quote real quick. Or if you want to just put a picture that to you represents translanguaging, we'll just get that started. So I'm going to drop that in the chat right now. And maybe I'll just leave the Padlet up so we can see each other's ideas as we go. So go ahead and take a moment and do that now. Awesome. Lots of good ideas coming in. I'll give you one more minute and then we'll chat about some of these. All right, awesome. So feel free to keep adding yours if you haven't yet, but we can chat a little bit about some of these. So yeah, this is great. And I think one thing that I love in seeing these definitions is because translanguaging is a few different things. Kind of what you pulled from the or what you pulled as your definition reflects that. I think Marco's your very succinct definition, like encompasses those different components, right? So it's both a practice, it's a theory, and it is a pedagogy. So some of you talked about kind of, I see Sky, you talked about the um, when a person is maybe using more than one language at the same time, right? So translanguaging often manifests as like what looks like using multiple languages at once. It can look like that. It can be someone who's, communicating entirely in one language and then communicating with someone in a different language immediately thereafter. It could be somebody processing something in a language, but maybe producing both or maybe just producing one. So it's kind of drawing upon your full linguistic repertoire, like many of you have said here. And Dorothy, I think your definition pulls from kind of the very original idea of translanguaging pedagogy. So the term translanguaging, as you read, was introduced in Welsh, and I don't speak Welsh, but the way that I think it was said was transwiethu, which was a specific approach to reading in one language and discussing it in another. So it's designed to be this kind of bilingual pedagogy. Since then, the idea of what translanguaging pedagogy can be has exploded, right? There's so many different ways to do translanguaging pedagogy, and we'll talk about a lot of different approaches in the class. And you saw in some of the lecture videos for this week some different ideas that I shared with you. You read about some in Garcia's book. So any pedagogy that is making space for students to use their full linguistic repertoire to support their learning, to affirm their bilingual and multilingual identities, is a translanguaging pedagogy. So all of these are great kind of different pieces of what translanguaging is, right? Like Triana says here, a way of using all of the linguistic resources to make meaning. And I like, Stephanie, that you highlight that it's to meet a particular purpose, right? People translanguage with purpose. Sometimes the purpose is just I'm communicating with my bilingual family. So I'm translanguaging because that's my whole repertoire, and I can do that when I'm with my bilingual family. Other times, people are translanguaging strategically to achieve a particular purpose, right? So they might use a particular word in a different language than the language that they started with, because it better reflects what they're trying to say. It's the way that somebody else said it. It's the name they use for that thing in a given language. So it would be silly to translate it. So there's lots of reasons why people translanguage who can, who are multilingual and bilingual. And so this, I think, is a great way to get at that. Awesome. Questions or comments about anything that you see here? All right. Well, I will get you talking eventually, but we can we can move forward. This is a great way to get us started, though. Okay. Awesome. So let's jump in then with a few different key concepts. So I went through the readings and pulled out some words that I think are really important for you to understand and hopefully to use as you continue learning about translanguaging through this course. So I wanted to spend some time talking about what they are, and I grouped them into these two main buckets. So there's concepts that kind of help us theorize and understand language and bilingualism. And then there's concepts that relate to how we create learning spaces that are bilingual and multilingual, or learning spaces with bilingual and multilingual students in them. So we'll talk about some of these terms, and in between each of these buckets, I'm going to break us, give you a moment to kind of share some takeaways, and then we'll go into the second bucket. So take a look at this list. And I also very much encourage you to bring any other terms or concepts to this conversation that you read about and want more clarification about. So the first one I wanted to mention, which I know many of you know, because if you've taken a class with me, you've probably heard me use it, is emergent bilingual. So some of you, this was the first time you've heard this term. Is anyone willing to unmute and tell us kind of what is the term emergent bilingual? What is it? Who is an emergent bilingual? What does this term mean?
Yeah, so my understanding is that an emergent bilingual is anyone who is drawing from, multiple language, doesn't just have to be two, and kind of progressing through learning that language, kind of either simultaneously or maybe begin with one, but you are working on the development of both those languages.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so I like that you mentioned that it can be a bilingual person or a multilingual person. And Garcia specifically introduces it as a replacement term for English learner, right? So we often say English learner, a student who's a K-12 student, who's learning, still acquiring grade level English. And Garcia says, yeah, we need to be able to have a word to talk about this group of students, but English learner is focused on what they lack. So she proposes emergent bilingual as a way to draw attention to the fact that they come into classrooms, students who are English learners come into classrooms with all of these additional linguistic resources, right? Some of them are in one language, some are in many, as you said, Marcos. And they're also becoming bilingual by learning English, right? So they're adding English to their repertoire. In Rhode Island, we use the term, what term do we use in Rhode Island?
Multilingual learners.
Yeah, and I saw Patricia make the MLL. Yeah, multilingual learner, MLL, which is also a more asset-oriented term. In New York City, they've started to use EB or emergent bilingual because of Ophelia's work in New York. But I encourage you to use MLL or EB or whatever asset-oriented term you can when you're talking about this student population, because it does, I think, do a better job of recognizing that the student is not just learning English, they are bilingual, multilingual kids who are becoming bilingual through the process or becoming multilingual through the process of learning English. All right, linguistic repertoire. So a few of them I'll pause and I'll have you jump in on some of these I'll just talk through. So linguistic repertoire was talked about in the book, and I use it a lot. It's essentially a word that talks about an individual's entire unique language system. A fancy linguistic term for that is an idiolect. So I think you'll see that word in your reading for this week. But essentially, it's just everyone has their own linguistic repertoire. It has all of the language features from any named languages that we speak that are a part of it and beyond that, right? This is the visual you saw in your book on page 19 that I think is a nice way to visualize that. So Ophelia and others have argued that individuals have this kind of repertoire of language features, like you see in the pink box. And there might be features of English in that. There might be features of Spanish. But rather than think about bilingual people as double monolinguals, she argues that we should think about people as having this linguistic repertoire, and they draw from that repertoire strategically to communicate. And the term named language was used there, so I wanted to find that too. So named language, I don't think they didn't go into detail about that in the book for this week. But Ofelia Garcia often doesn't say language, she says named language, just to draw attention to the fact that languages are social constructs, right? So it's really hard once we start to kind of unpack English or Spanish or Portuguese, we begin to realize that what fits into that boundary is sometimes a little bit looser than we think. And so it's kind of drawing attention to the fact that a language becomes a named language because we make it so, right? So what we think of as standard American English is standard American English because of historical, political, and ideological forces. And I had you watch that amazing spoken poem by Dr. Jamila Liscott because I think she does a really nice job of talking about the Englishes that are a part of who she is, even though they're not always seen, recognized, right, as such. So sometimes like English might some of her Englishes might be viewed as bad or incorrect English, rather than as all of these different resources that are part of her repertoire, right? So if I say named language, or if you read named language, they're just trying to call attention to that languages don't just come into being, but we bound them in particular ways, and it's connected to historical, political, and ideological forces. All right, dynamic bilingualism. Does anybody want to take a stab at that one? So what does Garcia mean when she says that bilingualism is dynamic?
When I read, I found that it was two languages function in interrelationship and adapt to the communicative circumstances at hand, compared to like the additive, which was like the first is add to the second. So it seems like instead it's everything is kind of just mixing and melding when it's like appropriate. It says features that she uses to communicate appropriately in different situations, whereas just like one plus two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so she's trying to draw attention to the fact again here that like bilingualism is not double monolingualism. So it's not linguistic shorthand is we sometimes use L1 for first language, L2 for second language. So a bilingual person is not L1 plus L2, right? She's saying, in fact, bilingualism is dynamic, right? It's fluid, it's ever changing. I'm sure most of you can relate to that if you think about kind of your own language journey at different points in my life. I've had my languages, the languages that are part of my linguistic repertoire have changed. When I lived in Santiago, Chile, my Spanish was very strong. And in particular, my spoken Spanish was very strong. My written English has always been stronger than my Spanish. And I don't think I've ever had kind of a parity of languages. And that's true for many people. You develop the language features in your repertoire according to how you need to use them. And then you use them strategically and creatively to make meaning. So it's really trying to push away from thinking about bilingualism as double monolingualism, but thinking about it as having this single interconnected system that is dynamic. So moving away from this kind of monoglossic ideology, which is that like languages are separate and bounded. And Garcia is like the master of metaphors. So she uses these two different metaphors to talk about and explain what dynamic bilingualism is, which is exactly kind of how Shelby was just describing it. The banyan tree. How many of you have ever seen a banyan tree before? In real life? No. Oh, I'm looking to see. Yeah. Okay, they're so cool. Um, so banyan trees, as you can see in this picture, they like grow out and grow down, and their roots are all interconnected under the surface. And then from there, they sprout up new trees that maybe sometimes look a little separate, but they're all still interconnected. This is similar to kind of Jim Cummins' idea, if you've taken EDC 420, this idea that our language systems are interconnected. They have so many similarities across languages that are a part of our language system, rather than thinking of them as all very separate. And then this idea of bilingualism like an all-terrain vehicle. So unlike a balanced bicycle, an all-terrain vehicle adapts to the terrain that it encounters. It can move strategically to get over and around things. And she argues that bilingualism is more like an all-terrain vehicle, an ATV, and less like a bicycle. We're not trying to get balanced wheels. Here's my English wheel, here's my Spanish wheel, and now I have a perfectly balanced bilingual. She's saying it's, you develop your repertoire as you need to use it, and you develop your those linguistic features as you need them. Okay. Awesome. And then one final note for kind of how we are thinking about bilingualism. So she briefly mentions code switching versus translanguaging, which is an interesting conversation and debate even today in the field. I pulled out this quote that they had mentioned in the chapter from a book, The Three Wise Guys. And you can see in this quote from the book, the book is mostly in English, but uses Spanish words like mama and Dia de los Reyes, which a code switching scholar would say this is an example of code switching. The person is speaking in English and then they use Spanish, and that's code switching. The same piece of text could also be called translanguaging. So really the way I understand the difference between these two terms is that it just depends on the paradigm you're bringing to this text. So do I look at this and see somebody switching between codes, or do I look at this and say, this is somebody bringing their whole linguistic repertoire to communicate? So the same thing could be code switching or translanguaging depending on the lens we're using. And in this course, I'm hoping you begin to use the lens of translanguaging, which doesn't mean we can't say, yes, that's a feature from Spanish and these are features from English. Certainly we can still see the languages, the named languages that these belong to. But when we're approaching something like this from a translanguaging lens, we see it as somebody using their whole linguistic repertoire, not like turning on one part of their brain and turning off the other as they're switching between codes. Okay. So that was kind of a quick overview of a few of those concepts. I'll pause for a moment. I'm actually going to put these in the chat so we can see each other. But I'd love to hear, of these terms and concepts, were there any that you found interesting or compelling, and why? And in what ways are any of these ideas different from how you thought about language and bilingualism in the past? And then please let me know if you still have any questions. So I'm going to actually stop sharing because I think it's helpful for us to see each other's faces. There. So I'll put those in the chat, but let's take a minute or two to just kind of share out. Anyone who feels compelled to start can start. Yeah, thinking about those terms and ideas. Are any of them interesting or compelling to you? Are any of them different from how you've thought about bilingualism in the past?
I can start. So that what you just said about code switching and translanguaging, that just like solidified for me because I always like knew that they were very, very similar, but I had never, I don't know, found a way to differentiate them in my understanding. But it really helped when you said it depends on the lens that you're taking. And I think after I did take 420 with you, and then now with our focus on translanguaging, I do view, you know, when people are using different languages while they're speaking, I do view it as they are using their whole linguistic repertoire instead of like switching on and off between languages. And growing up around like my mom, who is from Mexico, and she is bilingual, she speaks English and Spanish with my abuelos. That's kind of how I see her use language. It's not like she's like going in between English and Spanish. It's like she, based on the context, she's using all of her, you know, resources to communicate with whoever is in front of her. But I liked that, like, it depends on your lens that you're looking through it. That was like a clarifying moment for me.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Yeah, and that's a great example you just shared too. And I do want to like give credit where credit's due. Like code switching research predates translanguaging by decades, and code switching scholars were really instrumental in kind of destigmifying. Is that the destigmifying? Yes. Sorry, it's been a long day. The act of code switching or translanguaging, right? So showing that code switching, translanguaging is something that is not someone who's confused. It's just the way that bilinguals and multilinguals communicate. And so that research from the 80s and 90s did a lot of work to try to change the way people thought about what that is. And now we're in a place where we're saying, okay, let's move away from even thinking about it as separate codes to thinking about it as one linguistic repertoire. Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Triana. Go ahead, Maura.
Hi. I feel like the example that you used for the holiday in the text blurb that you just showed, like the use of a proper noun helped me like understand the concept more because I hadn't thought about like there are terms and words that don't translate to English, and it wouldn't make sense to try and translate them, and to be able to use the proper noun for a holiday or somebody's name or an object or something. It's part of their culture and it's empowering, but it's also like helps me understand the concept more. I don't know if that makes sense, but like it's a really good example for me in my brain of like why translanguaging is so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Hmm. Yeah, and I think for bilingual people too, it's definitely for things like proper nouns and like certain foods that are always used in a certain language. But even like in my house, like we always say ropa sucia because my husband grew up calling the laundry basket the ropa sucia. And I don't think my kids know that it actually is called a laundry basket in English because it's just, he's always used it. We just all kind of started using it as a family. And so in our house, my girls put their dirty clothes in the ropa sucia. So I think there's just like certain words that they will always live in that language if it's a part of your family. Other terms or ideas or questions too about any of the ideas?
Yeah, I do kind of have a question about the kind of what we were just talking about, code switching versus translanguaging, right? So I kind of understand it as, or at least I understand it through the lens of someone who's bilingual, and the reading does mention how monolinguals do it as well. I was just wondering if you could kind of maybe clarify that a little bit for me, because when I think of like a monolingual, perhaps partaking in or translanguaging, I think more of code switching, right? Like I don't know, talking to a group about a scientific idea, but then reproducing that in a like scientific way. And I guess I'm just saying like I'm a science teacher, but
Yeah.
yeah, kind of like informal vocab versus like the formal vocab of the content or whatever it may be.
Yeah. So, right, exactly. And I know a few of you talked about this in your reflection post too. So, Garcia is arguing that, we can think about the translanguaging work happening in a given language, right? So when we're shifting between more social ways of using language or more informal ways of using language into particular discourse communities, like the language of science, or if I shift and I'm talking with a colleague, I might be using more academic words. If I'm giving a presentation, I'm going to use language differently than if I'm talking casually with a friend on my phone, right? So she's arguing that like these different register differences are also a form of translanguaging or code switching. And again, to me, those terms in some ways are interchangeable, except that they talk about it. It's a different paradigm that we're bringing, right? So that also could be thought of as translanguaging. And certainly like at the core of translanguaging work is multilingual and bilingual people. But I think it's an interesting point to think about how we all do use different registers, even though we don't always think about that as kind of moving across language in that way. And certainly when we think about dialects, right? Like somebody who uses different dialects of a language, that's translanguaging too, even though like all of it might be called English or all of it might be called Spanish or whatever language you're working within. So I think it's interesting to think about within a language how registers also might be a form of translanguaging. Yeah. Does that help clarify it a little bit? Sounds like you're kind of making sense of it that way too. Yeah. Awesome. Any final thoughts before we talk about bilingual classrooms or classrooms in general? Okay, let's jump into some more terms. All right, so now we're going to look at a few different words that are or concepts that connect to bilingual and multilingual learning spaces. And what I mean by this again is a space where there are bilingual and multilingual kids and youth learning, which could be an English monolingual space, it could be a bilingual educational space, it could be a world language space. So these are different ideas for theorizing learning spaces with bilingual and multilingual people. So this is something you'll come back to many times throughout the course, and this week especially we're focusing on translanguaging stance. But the translanguaging classroom framework that Ophelia and her colleagues propose in the book is kind of this interconnected piece. So a teacher who embraces translanguaging pedagogy is embracing a stance of translanguaging, right? So kind of believing that multilingual, bilingual kids bring their full selves into the classroom and that we have an obligation as teachers to do our best to welcome their whole linguistic repertoire because it is affirming who they are and also supports their learning. So that's kind of the stance piece of it. Translanguaging design, which is the actual pedagogy, right? So actually planning for translanguaging opportunities in your classroom. And then translanguaging shifts, which refers to kind of those moment-to-moment times in the classroom where there's an opportunity to bring translanguaging in. Maybe it wasn't pre-planned, but maybe a student mentions a word in their home language and you're like, oh, how do other people say that word? And then maybe you make a list of, oh, this is all of the ways. So especially in Spanish, I find it fascinating. And at some point, I think I'll show you I have this great visual of all the different ways that people say pen across Latin American countries. Like it's amazing to me that like a simple word can have so many different translations in Spanish. So you might pause and say, yeah, let's talk about that. How does everyone else say that here? Okay, yeah, we'll make a list. Oh, that's so interesting. Or you might pause and say, you know what, for this activity, go ahead and do it in whatever language you want, or let's make this turn and talk bilingual. So it's kind of the shifts that you make because you realize that there's an opportunity to support students' learning or to affirm students' bilingualism that you hadn't pre-planned. It wasn't part of the design, but because your classroom is a space that allows for that, it's a shift that can happen. So those are the kind of the three components that they propose are the translanguage and classroom framework. Multilingual ecology is also a word that they use, and we're going to be thinking about this quite a bit for this week, because multilingual ecology refers to a school or a classroom space where you see multiple languages used and valued. So I put up a couple anchor charts here, but it means if you walk around the classroom or if you walk around the school, you see multilingualism on the walls all around you. So that is what we mean by a multilingual ecology, or sometimes it's called like multilingual environmental print as well. This was an interesting one. So this was mentioned very briefly, but I love it. So how many of you are familiar with the zone of proximal development from your education courses? Yeah. So we know the ZPD is that space between what the learner can do already independently and what they can't yet do, right? It's that space of what a learner can do with support or with guidance. A bilingual zone of proximal development is a term that Louis Moll proposes as a way to kind of think about that space, that ZPD, as something that could be bilingual, right? So that's in some ways kind of like the translanguaging space. Like, how can I support students bilingually to mediate their learning and support their ability to engage with this? So just kind of another way of thinking about the ZPD when we're working with bilingual or multilingual kids. Language, bilingualism as one of those scaffolds and supports, which I think is a cool idea. Louis Moll is the one that came up with funds of knowledge. So you might have also heard his name then. Okay. Critical metalinguistic awareness, again, was mentioned briefly, but I think is worthy of some discussion. So we'll talk about this also this week too, but it's having an understanding of how language is used, how it affects others, and how it shapes our understanding of the world. This also means like being able to reflect on not just the structure of language, but also the power dynamics, the ideologies. So kind of developing this understanding about language from a critical lens. One of my favorite examples, and I can't remember if I put this in one of my mini lectures or not yet, comes from one of my friends who's at UMass Lowell, Chris Leader. She does this with her undergraduates, this activity they call bilingualism in the public eye, where they bring in examples of bilingualism and they analyze them from a critical lens. So she brought in this example, or a student brought in this example to her class of, does anyone know who this artist is?
Is it Bad Bunny?
It is Bad Bunny. Yeah. And this was at the Grammys, and he was performing at the Grammys. And you can see the caption that this was on the television screen. The caption was speaking non-English, singing in non-English, when he was kind of moving back and forth between English and Spanish. And so they use this as an entry point into thinking about language and power with some of these discussion questions that you see. So does it surprise you that the broadcast network didn't translate what he said, didn't even say that he was speaking in Spanish or, and then they had the discussion of like, as our entertainment industry becomes more multilingual and global, should we be demanding that our broadcast transcription give either translations or the original language script? I mean, we have technology that can transcribe in Spanish. Why wouldn't we expect that of our broadcasting, right? So interesting to think about power in language and what gets written on a screen and what doesn't. So that is an example of something that would help foster some critical metalinguistic awareness. So thinking about language, how we use it, the connection between language and power. And then you also read this word. You'll see this again throughout the book, the translanguaging corriente. Does anybody remember or know what corriente means in Spanish?
Like flow?
Like flow, yeah. Current, yeah. So the word corriente means current, and they kind of talk about it like a current or a flow. Again, Ophelia loves metaphors, so this idea of a river, and it's, the image on your book is a river for that reason. So she talks about your classroom becoming a translanguaging corriente, so kind of having it be a space where you can always engage with language dynamically. So changing it from a static linguistic landscape. So if you're in a bilingual classroom, that might mean this is English space, this is Spanish space, or this is Portuguese space. Or if you're in an English only classroom or an English mainstream classroom, saying this is an English only space, to a space that is more dynamic and that allows for more flexibility. And then finally, and this is especially important for those of you in bilingual settings, but I think it's important for everybody, this distinction between general linguistic performance and language specific performance. And I'll come back to this in other weeks as well. But she talks about how it's important to think about our goals when we are designing for translanguaging. When the goal is for students to just show us what they know and can do, that's an example of general linguistic performance being required. So I don't care if the student shows me what they know in English. They can show me what they know in any language, and that will help me understand what they know and can do. So if my focus is on the content, my focus is on their sense making, I don't care as much about the language they're using to do that. A language specific performance is when I'm really wanting a student to demonstrate what they know and can do in a specific language. And there are reasons we want students to do that, right? If we tell students they can use, if we're in a bilingual setting, like my daughter's at Nuestro Mundo learning in English and Spanish, if my daughter is never asked to do something in Spanish, she will use English, right? Like if she's not asked to write it in Spanish, her preference would probably be to write it in English. And so students often do have language dominances or language preferences. So there are times when we want to say, no, I want you to do this in Spanish. I will give you the tools to do this in Spanish. Or I want you to do this in English. Let's read this together in English. Let's write this together in English. But there are other times when, if you just want to see what the student understands or want the student to show you what they can do, that focus isn't as important. And it's the same when we're working in English mainstream classrooms. I've worked with some teachers who say, oh, I just translate everything and give it to my MLLs or to my EBs. If you always give them a translated text, you're not supporting them to learn how to engage with it in English, right? So translated text can be a great resource, but not if you're never then also providing those resources and supports for them to engage with something in English as well. So being really strategic about when we are making space for these language specific performances and giving those supports, and when we want to have when the translanguaging spaces, we want that to be created so they can show us what they know and can do across their whole linguistic repertoire. And I sometimes just use these terms that I think are a bit more straightforward, but get at the same idea. Is it a flexible languaging space? Is my goal just getting at what they know and can do and supporting them to do that? Or is it a really focused languaging space? I want them to show me that they can do this in this target language because I want to also be making sure that I'm supporting their ability to do this in the target language. So that's something I will come back to as we continue in the course. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing again so we can talk about it. The same questions are up, except I guess I can show I lost it. Okay, I'll put them again in the chat. So that is the end of me throwing terms at you, but we'll take a moment to pause. So any of those terms that we just talked about, interesting or compelling, and are any of these ways different ways for you for thinking about learning spaces, especially for bilingual, multilingual kids, or thinking about bilingual and multilingual learning spaces?
I thought it was really interesting. I think it's called is it Translanguaging Corriente?
Mhm.
That kind of connected back to me to, I'm trying to think about what article it was. I think it was that very first one about like about the emergent bilingual studies and like about the history of it, and it kind of talked about how the separate language allocation policies, it like referred to it as like stopping the flow of Spanish to English, like the flow of blood from the heart to the veins. And that kind of reminded me of that flow when going back to it, when I read about that later and how it's like you can't really stop that. Like that flow is really important for multilingual learners. So that kind of connected back to that earlier. I thought that was really interesting when reading.
Awesome. Thanks for that connection, Shelby.
It was important for me to think about when I think about being a future bilingual teacher, creating like specific, like strategically making spaces for the translanguaging to happen, because I wrote in my my discussion post, so the school that I was student teaching at, they like, it was their like, not policy, but it was like their idea. They kept the languages very separate. So it was like one language in the morning, one language in the afternoon, and they didn't really mix them or, so when I came in and I knew about translanguaging and I had to do my own lessons, and me being a second language learner myself, like learning Portuguese, like using my English to help me learn Portuguese was a big help. So like comparing the languages and using what you know in your first language to help you with your second language. So because they didn't really use both languages at the same time, I came in and I wanted to kind of try to do that in my lesson, and I could tell like my clinical educator was very supportive, and she was very flexible like with what I wanted to do, but I know I could feel she was like uncomfortable because that's not how they do it there at their school. But so like I can respect the idea of keeping the minority language, like not letting English dominate. So I totally understand that. But I liked reading about how, like, not necessarily all the time, but you have strategic times or places where you have the translanguaging so that it's not always like so restrictive and so one or the other.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I'm curious to know Patricia's thoughts too, given that you also work in that space. Because it is with dual language classrooms, it's tricky because you do want to make sure you are creating a focused language space, but focused does not mean you never have a space where there can be some translanguaging, some comparison, some, it's important to kind of think about, okay, how can I strategically recognize that these are bilingual kids and that we are bilingual people, kind of performing monolingually sometimes, but that we have these resources we're bringing, while recognizing that like English is so dominant. And so if you just make it a translanguaging space, you often just end up with a lot of English. And so I think there is a tension there, but that doesn't mean we throw it all away and say language separation all the time, at least in my view. But Patricia, yeah, I'd love to hear.
Can I just add, it depends on how the school is structured from kinder to fifth grade. So it could be 80-20 or 70-30. And the 80, it will be located to the Portuguese and the 20 for the English. And sometimes that goes for specials, like if it's music, if it's art or PE. And moving up, it will become what the state wants to be or whatever that they understand for a bilingual classroom, that it needs to have 50-50. And that doesn't mean, because then from there, I believe that's from the teacher perspective to create that kind of flexibility between languages. There's a certain minutes per day or per week that we should have between the languages. I don't know, it is a policy. However, in my classroom, I believe that it has to be something constant. I may be talking with them, and some of my students will be answering. Sorry, I will be talking with them in Portuguese, and some of them will be responding to in English. But then some other moments that they feel confident, they will be answering to me in Portuguese. So it depends, like, for example, science or social studies, they feel like they don't have sufficient vocabulary to, sorry, it's just my daughter's right next to me and she's opened a bottle. And so regarding to social studies and science, some students don't feel comfortable with vocabulary that we are introducing to them, even if I try to do it in Portuguese, which is also brings the whatever that they call high curriculum that we have in place, that most of the time doesn't bring the bilingual part of it, which, for example, they can be selling a product that it says that has Spanish, but then it doesn't have the Portuguese part of it. And we have to create them. And imagine to balance those two, it requires a lot of work, a lot of investment, and not by translating those articles or materials, but to make sure that the students will have a balance. And that's when, at least in my classroom, I try to bring like the translanguaging in whatever perspective that I was taught before, which it was like probably regarding to code switching, and oh, that's completely different from translanguaging. And then I'm learning something that actually they kind of connect with each other. It depends in what kind of point we use them. But it depends in the classroom, it depends with the teacher. And of course, it also goes along with school policies and whatever that the right, for example, understands as bilingual classroom and dual language concepts.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia. Yeah, and so I mean, I think it's, you figuring out how to kind of work within what we know about the reality of bilingualism and how we think about effective bilingual learning spaces is I think continues to be a tension with dual language classrooms, but I think a productive tension. And I think Patricia made a great point saying this is for everyone, right? Like, translanguaging is not just translation, so it doesn't mean that I just translate everything for students, or that, I mean, that's translation can be a really useful support, but that is not like exclusively what translanguaging is. And certainly in a bilingual classroom, if I'm just standing up and saying it in English and Spanish or English and Portuguese back and forth, that's not going to be very helpful for my students. But it is about thinking, like, are there moments when I can strategically create a space for students to tap into their whole linguistic repertoire? Can this project be a bilingual project? I've worked with some dual language teachers who've had their students create things bilingually, as opposed to just in English or just in Spanish. Or just in Portuguese in this case. So I think it's thinking about how you can tap into your students' whole linguistic repertoire. And those of you in English spaces, I think translanguaging tends to be a net positive, because in those spaces, the language of power is in the space, right? So as long as translanguaging pedagogy is not just translating everything into the students' L1 and never giving them a chance to build their English repertoire, I think it's a positive to bring more diverse linguistic resources into that space. Awesome. Okay. I'm going to stop us there because I'm looking at the time and want to make sure we have plenty of time for you to share with one another. But happy to continue the conversation when you get back to. So we're going to go into small groups now, so you can share your identity text with one another. I hope it was fun to create these. I know I always enjoy getting to be a bit more creative than in the traditional university course. So what we'll be doing is I'll put you in some small groups, give everyone a chance to share. And when you share, you can explain your language portrait, your I am from poem. If you feel like reading the whole thing, you can, or you can just talk about it. And then after each person shares, make a little bit of time to ask questions or make a connection before you move on to the next person. And I'll try to put you in small groups of like 3 people so that you have enough time to all share together. And then we'll come back together, and I would love for you to briefly share anything you learned about yourself or about each other from sharing these. And I'm briefly going to share my language portrait with you, since I am not going to join a group, so that you can see this, and then I'll give you a chance to go. This is who I am linguistically. So I am mostly English dominant, but I have been speaking Spanish and learning Spanish for a long time. Spanish has allowed me to travel and live in other places, so I made my foot purple to represent that. And part of my brain and part of my hand, I use Spanish quite a bit in my professional life. Although certainly I think English is my dominant language. I studied Portuguese briefly. I went to Brazil. Eu falo pouco de português, não muito, but a little bit. I spent a summer in Salvador, the Bahia in Brazil, and attempted to learn some Portuguese. And then I've been working for over a year now on Polish. I made my phone Polish because it's mostly through Duolingo that I've been doing that. But it connects to my heart because my grandmother spoke Polish. So it's the closest heritage language I have. And I've been trying to kind of reclaim that for myself. So that is who I am. I'm not going to read you my I am from poem because I shared it with you online, but this I think also talks a little bit more about who I am as someone who uses language and just who I am. So I will put you in groups again, make sure everyone has a chance to share, and then we'll come back again after you've all gotten to share and talk a little bit about it. Questions before we jump into some breakout groups? Okay. Let me think this will get us to 3 people in a room. So go ahead into your room and I will bring you back in about 15 minutes. Oh, I have to hit open. There we go.
Sorry, I don't know how I got back to the meeting room.
No worries. Oh, it's not letting me put you in room 3. Let me see. You're gonna get introduced to room 1, but don't go in.
Okay.
I can then move you to room 3. Yep. Now, okay. I put you in room 3.
Thank you.
welcome back. Did everyone have enough time to share? Okay, great. Just trying to keep an eye on your microphones to make sure everyone was able to get it in. Good, good, good. And it looks like it worked for folks to be able to share their screen if they wanted to. Some of you were doing that. Awesome. Awesome. All right, I'll get this back up again. So we have the questions. Okay, welcome back. I hope everyone had enough time to share. Oh, it looks like we've got one more minute. There we go. Now we're all back. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome back. Did anyone not have enough time to share? Don't see any hands. Okay, good. So we'll just take a couple minutes to just do some kind of share out of the experience of creating your own identity text or sharing yours. I'm just curious to know, what did you learn about yourself or about other people from creating these texts and sharing them?
I can go. So you actually put us all in a group that were all special educators. So it was kind of interesting to see that lens that we used. Stephanie and I actually included some teacher talk in our portraits. And so it was interesting to see that perspective and not just the name languages, but also the languages that we use every day. So in my portrait, I also included an iPad as an augmentative and alternative communication device because a lot of my students use those. So it was interesting to see the different take on how people saw themselves in their portrait and not just the name languages, but also things that we do every day, including, as Stephanie said, mom talk, the stuff that we have to say and how we say it too. So that was really interesting in my group.
Oh, I love that. And I did not do that intentionally, but kudos to Zoom for
Yeah.
Zoom. And that reminds me of what Marcos was saying earlier about like these like register differences and yeah, thinking about like language more expansively in the different ways we use it. Awesome, so cool. Other insights or thoughts?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
It was interesting that with the vast languages that we had in our group, we were not focused in flags. I was more related because sometimes there's this connection with language connected to a flag or to a country in specific. But the pride and how can I say? Yes, the pride in knowing the language without, I will look like no barriers. It's a language, and they were able to be defined as something that it belongs in each of our hearts. So I think that that was something that it caught my attention. Like we're not focused in one specific territory, but maybe for some people, yes, but the fact of being able to um not have that kind of connection, like no barriers between.
No, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think it's interesting how sometimes language is so rooted to place, and other times, yeah, it's tied to our sense of self, but maybe not necessarily to a specific nation state, a specific context there. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So one more person want to share out something you took away or kind of a reflection from the experience?
I thought it was really cool how both my group members tied like their language experience to like food, and I think it's clear that like language and culture are just so intertwined together that we think about language, but we think about food or customs and things like that. And I thought that was really cool that everyone kind of mentioned the culture they grew up with when they think of their languages.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And sometimes, and I know Shelby might remember this, and when I teach my undergraduate class, I sometimes like really encourage teachers and students to move beyond the 3 Fs of culture. Have you heard that before? Food, flags, and festivals. But then I often reflect like, yes, it is important that we go deeper, but also food, flags, and festivals are really tied to language and to culture and to identity. So I think it's interesting that like we do often see language and ourselves manifested in those ways, right? Through the food that we eat, through the different event like festivals and celebrations we participate in. Yeah, for sure. Thanks for sharing that, Marcos. Awesome. Okay. I'm going to move us forward because I want to make sure we have some time to talk about this week. But I'm really looking forward to diving into your reflections that you submitted and to your poems. So thank you. And this week you get one more kind of arts-based way to think about language as we think about what it means to hold a translanguaging stance and our own kind of thinking about that as a social justice commitment, in addition to thinking about kind of language as it is used in the world around us. So this week you have a few different viewings and readings. There's a very short video from Yasone Sonos and Dirk Gorder. I'm actually going to see Yasone in a couple weeks. I will be coming to you from, not from Rhode Island, but there's a conference on bilingualism in Spain. Yasone is in the Basque Country. That's where she's based, and she's giving a keynote. So I will get to see her, which is awesome. She's very cool and does a lot of work around multilingualism and translanguaging. I should see if I can get her to like jump into our class. No promises, but that would be super cool. Anyway, so they will talk a little bit about their work and how they defined translanguaging. You'll be reading the next 2 chapters in our book. This awesome article. I don't often use Teen Vogue in my courses, but this article is fabulous about this writer processing like her Spanglish, which she calls Spanglish, right? And how she uses Spanish in her stories. And then you'll be reading what is probably the most like academically dense piece of the course, but I think it's really powerful. So get yourself a good cup of coffee and some quiet space to read it, but it's really well written. Rejecting abyssal thinking in the language and education of racialized bilinguals, and it's kind of how Garcia and other scholars think about translanguaging as a social justice stance and why. So those are the readings and viewings. There's also a short video called The Gift that I threw in there that I think is really powerful as well. So enjoy that. You'll be doing the discussion board for Friday and then Sunday, and then the application activity will be the linguistic landscape or linguistic schoolscape, which will be in presentation form. You'll record it, and then you'll also be giving your presentation to one another, again, in small groups. The recording is so I can make sure that I see all of them. So I wanted to briefly talk a little bit about what that is, and then I'll open it up for questions too. We'll skip that because we talked about translanguaging stance a little bit already and how it's tied to the social justice orientation. Okay. So for your presentation, you have 2 options. If you are working in a school, I highly encourage you to do the schoolscape because I think you will maybe notice things about your school's environmental print, the ecology of your school that maybe you haven't paid attention to before. And so what you do essentially is you walk around, bring your phone, take pictures, and document the languages that you see. And as you do that, think about how does what I see reflect the languages spoken by students in the school. Maybe not always audibly spoken, but the languages that are part of their repertoire. And what does the print also tell you about how languages are valued, whose languages are valued, anything that you can learn about kind of what you're seeing in relation to language. If you are not in a school, or if you would prefer to do it outside of a school, choose a place where you know there are multilingual or bilingual people that sometimes occupy that space or that always occupy that space, and document what you see there. Where do you see English? Where do you see languages other than English? What does the environmental print tell you about the community that lives there? What does it tell you about language and power, about what languages are valued in that space? So you kind of do the same kind of analysis, but in a community somewhere. And so I'll give you 2 examples. One is at my daughter's school, a school that I've worked with quite closely over the last couple of years, Nuestro Mundo. I had some teachers there do this walkthrough at their school, and we found some really cool things and also some things that made them think about, oh, okay, even in a bilingual space, we sometimes don't always lift up the minoritized language. So this is a little bit about the school. It's been open since 2021. So if you do choose a school, please give us a little bit of a background of, who's there. Here you can see that 65% of the students identify as Latinx, 38% are identified as MLLs, 48% free and reduced lunch. And you can see here this picture, how like the flags are like showing students from all different, like kind of recognizing the diversity of the student body, honoring all of these different kind of places of origin of the students and their families. But one thing you might also notice is that the doors are listed first grade Spanish, first grade English. And we talked about how like Spanish is written in English, right? It's not first grade Espanol, it's first grade Spanish, first grade English. And so we talked about how like that's probably something no one even thought about, right? But kind of showed something about kind of the default language there. And we noticed that in other places in the school too, like when you walk into the school, it says welcome. We often noticed that English was first, Spanish was second, English was sometimes bigger. And again, not all of these things were probably intentional, but we talked a little bit about language and power and what, how in a bilingual school, you always have to be thinking about like, how can we like combat this by really lifting up the non-English languages? But we also noticed in spaces this was the special ed coordinator, she created this like Rincón de las Emociones that was like mostly Spanish. She included some English. And so she kind of created this translanguaging space for students to come in and share how they were feeling. And that you can see they can pull like situations and problems from these little things below, and they can talk about them. And she had them bilingual. And so we talked about where we saw bilingual spaces in the school too. So this just gives you an idea of like some of the types of things you can look at. Certainly thinking about like in some of you that are not in bilingual schools, you might see quite a bit of English. So where do you see non-English languages represented at all? And how does that match the student body? This is an example of what a linguistic landscape potentially could look like. So I did this last year. I walked around. You can see here, if you ever want to come hang out, I live in the Edgewood neighborhood of Cranston, and I'm kind of situated between what I describe as the red, white, y azul, because if you go south, you are in like old Rhode Island, super like patriotic, red, white, and blue. And if you go a mile north, you are in like the little Dominican Republic, like everything is in Spanish, but they also have red, white, and blue painted on the ground because the Dominican flag is also red, white, and blue. And so I live between like these colors, but they represent very different things to the communities that occupy them. And so I went around and took some pictures. And if I was doing this as my presentation, I would kind of analyze these in depth with you. But you can see here, most of what I see when I drive north is a lot of Spanish. I see translanguaging, like the word restaurant with El Fogón Latino. Like when they have signs about who to vote for, some of them aren't even translated into English. It's like just in Spanish. But I also noticed like there's a Muslim community center that I hadn't noticed before I did this photo activity, and that made me curious about like other groups that live in this community. When I drove south, I saw lots of English, but not exclusively. The restaurant names often represent the type of food that's there. So going back to your point, Marcos, about food and language. But I did mostly see English. I saw English on the signs of the Pawtucket Baptist Church, lots and lots of patriotic symbols. I also found this interesting plaque that I hadn't noticed before that talked about the history of the region, which originally was settled by the Patuxet tribe. What's interesting, though, is there's no Narragansett language anywhere. Even the sign is in English. And so I was thinking about like the community that used to occupy this space and kind of the lasting heritage is the sign, but what else could be in that space? So after I did this, I had questions for myself, and I encourage you to also kind of write your questions that you have. Find the answers for some of them if you can, or you can just leave us with some ongoing questions about what you hope to learn. So these were some of mine, like curious about the size of the Dominican community in South Providence and other communities that live in South Providence. I was curious about Patuxet Village and the history of the Narragansett tribe in the region and to what extent the current inhabitants engage with Indigenous communities. And so some of the things that I was left thinking after that experience. So for your presentation, plan on 5 to 7 minutes, put together some slides with some of the pictures and give us some analysis so situate us in what the place is, and then talk about what you saw and analyze it from the lens of language and power. So what language is being elevated or not? what is it telling us about the people who live there? Do you see translanguaging? Are there examples of languages coming together? Or when you see languages, are they always kept strictly separate? If it's what kinds of things are translated if they're translated? So is it just like warnings that are translated into a different language, but not the rest of the text? So you might notice some interesting things as you start to walk around. So when you're in your presentation, give us a framing, brief reflection on what you learned, and kind of your analysis when you present. I'll pause there because that's been a lot of me talking at you. Questions or thoughts about linguistic landscapes or schoolscapes?
I have a question. I know you suggested if you work in a school to do like the schoolscape, even if your school has like even like even though it's going to be almost 100% English, use it to kind of like say that,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
kind of make a point. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I would say last year,
Okay.
most people said that. They said like, wow, 30% of the student
Okay.
body are MLLs, or like, I know that there are a lot of multilingual students here, and this is what I saw. Yes, so it's totally fine to say like everything was in English. I think that tells you something too. Or like to go digging, like in one example, they found that the ESL teacher's room, the person who did like ESL pullout, her room was multilingual. That was the only multilingual space in the school. Or like the world language teachers had other languages, but that was it. So yeah, one example, they found that when students created posters, there was a high school example, those were bilingual, but when adults created posters, they were in English. And so that was interesting too. So just even if you're in an English dominant space, I think it's interesting to see like what evidence, if any, do you see of other languages, and to think about that. But you don't have to. If you'd rather go to a community somewhere, you're welcome to do that, or your own community where you live. Yeah, and I know, Shelby, you had messaged me about spaces too. I have had people do places around URI before. So you can go, so like URI has people who speak other languages there. So you can even, as long as it's a space where you know that like multilingual people are there, you can go, like someone did the student union once and walked around and took pictures of the student union because multilingual students attend URI.
So we can
Go ahead.
so we can go even like obviously no one's really at URI right now. But so even though like I know there are people who speak different languages there, I can maybe just pull statistics about URI and then go into some different buildings and check it out.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions or thoughts? Okay. And then the rubric is uploaded already, but this is what I'm looking for again. So kind of a wide variety of photos, your description that kind of clearly situates it for us, your analysis of kind of critical analysis of what you see, and then your reflection on what you learned from doing it. And I love linguistic landscapes. So I'm so excited to see what you learn. I did include on Brightspace a bunch of other resources. So if you want to see more examples of what these look like, I think I linked a whole webinar from Dirk Gorder talking about what linguistic landscapes are. And a lot of this work has been done outside of the US. So these are very big in different places around Europe. A lot of scholars have worked on these as a way to kind of more deeply understand language and language in the spaces around us. So there's tons of resources online if you're kind of feeling stuck and you want some suggestions. Yeah, and that is it. So we have about 5-ish minutes left. So I'll stop there, open it up for questions, and then if there's no questions, we can also wrap up early. Okay. Well, I will stay on for anyone who wants to hang out and chat. If you have a pending question that you want to ask after everyone hops off, that's fine too. I'm so excited to see these, and I'm excited for you to dive into the content for this week. So feel free to reach out if you do have further questions via email or to hang out. Otherwise, I will see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Lara, I do have a question. For example, if I need to answer to one of our classmates, and after I'd already finished and answered 2 other questions, or to the other responses, I mean, I noticed that there's no time to go back and answer to a person that had a question, for example.
Oh,
I don't know.
who asked you a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the discussion board closes at
Okay.
on Sunday,
Sunday.
but I mean, I could open that up if you want to be able to go in and respond. Because you wanted to
Okay.
respond to something that someone said.
Yeah, or not sure if there was a question or if I needed, or I felt like I needed to say a yes to what they were saying,
Mhm.
and then not leave it like quiet after that, because I feel like in the past that's what I have been doing because there's no time, and
Mhm.
I feel like, is there a way that we can contact that person like, hey, like, yeah, I do agree with you, or thank you for highlight that point. I'm not sure. It's just not, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, so we have a couple options. So either I could just extend it. I have it listed as a Sunday deadline, so everyone knows like this is when you want to have it in by. But I could
Yeah,
make it
yeah.
up
And I
longer.
don't want you to,
But alternatively, you can also direct message any.
yeah, I don't want that to, oh, okay.
Let me see if I could show you that real quick. Let's see. Here's our class. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again.
Okay, thank you.
So I might need
Sorry.
to, oh, you're good. I'm a learner. Hopefully this will work. So if you go to class list, I think you should still be able to see
Mhm.
everyone. So if I wanted to
Okay.
send Aiden a message, you just check that person's name, and if you click email, then it
Oh,
goes to
okay.
them. So you can send them an email that way.
Okay, that's
Looks like
great.
you can also,
Sorry, I didn't know that's, or I never had the opportunity to dive deep in this kind of option, but that's awesome then.
yeah. So just go to class list and you'll be able to see everybody there.
Okay, because I even thought that I missed, because I'm not sure if he's here. Oh, Marcos. I forgot to send the link of the article that I read that I found after, and then I couldn't enter that there. So now I have the opportunity. I will be sharing with you then.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks, Patricia.
Thank you.
Awesome. Marcos, do you want to go next since you were?
Yeah, no problem. I'm actually really sorry for even asking. I know it's like a very short 5-week thing where we're meeting, but next Tuesday I do kind of have a conflict timing with our high school graduation. So I just kind of want to see if I'd be okay. It'd be okay for me to miss leaving kind of pretty early because it'd be kind of at 5. I'm happy to make it up in any other way. Whatever kind of you ask of me, I'm happy to do.
Okay.
Or is that like not?
You're out of the class. That's it.
Yeah.
No, I know that it's like the time of year when these things are happening. Yeah, so I will have you record your landscape anyway, because you're submitting it so that I can watch them all afterwards.
Yeah.
So yeah, let me think if there's anything that I want you to do as a makeup. But yeah, I know it happens every now and then where this, someone has to miss a class, and I get it. But I appreciate you letting me know, and yeah, I'll think if there's a way that you can engage with some of the content.
Of course, and happy to do whatever it is. And like I said, I'm just sorry that this happens to be, the conflict. It might not be a conflict depending on the weather, but it looks like it is going to be clear skies. But in the case it did rain, then I'd be here in class.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, I'm not going to pray for rain, but I will, because it's good to be able to get outside for graduation stuff. But yeah, sounds good. And yes, we'll be in touch.
Great, thank you so much.
Mhm. All right, whoever wants to go next can.
Hi. I just wanted to, because I had emailed about the response to my peers, and then I also had emailed about like study abroad because I'm very interested in that. But I just had like this weekend was just very hectic with like my sister graduating on Saturday, and I just completely forgot to respond to the two peers. So I did send you one of the responses, but I know you just told, or you just said to Patricia that it closed at like 11:59, which I understand because you did say that, but I didn't know if like I could make it up for like maybe like half credit, or like if you have like anything like regarding that. And I just want to ask you about that.
Yeah, yeah, and sorry I haven't responded yet. I
That's
did see
fine.
both of your emails, and I started a response to your first one, but then I felt like it required more time, and didn't send it. Yes, I see one of the posts. I'm happy to accept that late for credit. I know that that happens. I keep the deadline so that it's like it shows up on Brightspace that you have that
Yeah.
deadline.
Mhm.
But yes, I'm happy to give you credit for that one. I only see one. Was it just the one that you sent?
Oh, sorry, I have to resend the second one, but I'll do that in a few minutes.
Okay, yeah, if you can get those to me, I'm gonna go through and do that tonight, so I can look at that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, for study abroad, I had put together some resources I was sending your way, so I will get that back to you. Thanks for reminding me.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear you're interested in teaching abroad
Yeah,
or studying abroad. It's, yeah, a big passion of mine too, so, yeah, awesome.
thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Bye, Sky.
Bye.
Hi.
Hello.
So I had reached out about TaskStream, but I spoke to my advisor, Dr. King, and she said that I am going to be able to submit work that I've already submitted for other classes because I'm kind of on like a weird path at URI. So I was just accepted. I was a non-matriculating student and I got 24 credits in the master's program, and then they accepted me. And so now I have this class and then 519 next spring and
Okay.
one summer class. But she said that I would be able to upload my information to TaskStream. And then
Yes.
I'm waiting to hear back from RIDE because I applied for my expert residency. I got my praxis done and I passed for TESOL. So I'm hoping to be applying to jobs for this coming school year. But one thing that I am struggling with is, and this might not be the time for it because if this is just a brief moment, but I don't know how I would really scaffold and like monitor and assess student learning as a monolingual teacher in a bilingual space because I want to be able to like provide my students with the most welcoming and inclusive environment, and I know how good it is for them, but I'm like kind of having imposter syndrome thinking about like how am I gonna make sure that like how am I gonna assess them, and I want to be the best teacher I can for them. So I don't know if this is the time to talk about that, but it's like on my mind a lot.
Yeah, no, and I think that's it's an important question too to be thinking about because, and I think like it's clear that you're already bringing a translanguaging stance to your students and thinking about like, okay, how do I like do this well, recognizing that my students bring all of these other resources into the classroom. And I'm sorry, I'm seeing on Sunday you had sent me an email too that I hadn't responded to yet. So, so I was just looking for your
that
note.
question because you said that we can respond to a peer as our
You can, yeah.
recorded response. Okay, so I'm good on that. But yeah.
Yes, and I am available for office hours if you want to talk further after today too. But yeah, for TaskStream, you're good because you will get an account and you can upload everything that you've uploaded before. We'll just have to figure out what grades you had gotten on them. So I don't know if you have the grade, like if you have those things graded or you have the feedback, that would help us because then we input it into TaskStream. And any course that you took with Rabia Haas, she's no longer with us, so we'll have to because she moved into a leadership role at Southern Connecticut. So we'll figure it out. But yes, the short answer is TaskStream. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm excited for you to engage with our third week content because I think that's when we watch. There's a short webinar series. You're welcome to watch it early if you want to see it early, called Teaching Emergent Bilinguals When You're Not One. And it's all about like how do English speaking teachers create spaces for multilingual learners that are affirming, that help understand what they know and can do. And there's some really good examples embedded within that. I think you'll also see some good examples in the book that we're reading for the course as well. But I think the most important thing is just like to affirm that you're like even thinking about this at all, because I think so many teachers are like, well, they need to learn English and, oh, well, what do we do? And there are, because especially we live in the world we live in today, there's so many tools for teachers who don't speak the language to still create spaces for students to use other languages to find out what they know. So if you're teaching a student who's literate in a language other than English, allowing them to write in that language when they're a newcomer, as they're saying, okay, you can do this assignment in Arabic or in Spanish or in Portuguese, and letting them have that space. And you can use Google Translate on your phone and scan it, and it'll tell you what it says. I think there's ways that we can then, even if you don't speak the language yet, you can allow them the space to do some things in their home language, or to sit with a peer who shares a language if there's someone who speaks their language, so they can process. And that sometimes to teachers makes them nervous because you're like, oh, I don't know what they're saying. But I always say, like, students can say things that you don't want them to say in English too, right? Like, you just have to kind of trust that you're creating a space where you're allowing the student to process. And I know that when I lived in Chile, even with like very good Spanish, there were times where I'd be sitting in a faculty meeting and it was like so much information, oftentimes in a more formal register of Spanish than I used casually. And so I would turn to a friend who spoke English and be like, can you explain to me what's happening right now? And having that clarification like helped me come back into the moment and be like, oh, okay, this is what we're doing. And students need that too, right? So I think there are so many ways you can strategically create those types of spaces, and then still figure out what they're doing in the sense they're making using some of the tools that we have at our disposal.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I was just like panicking about it because I know I've been a TA for 4 years in special ed, and I feel like I could go into a special ed classroom tomorrow and like really rock it, but now I'm kind of like actually looking at being a teacher and a head teacher in a ESL classroom, and I'm like, wait a minute, I'm just like starting to doubt myself a little bit. So yeah, I'm excited for next week and the content. And then the last thing is that I grew up on Grand Ave in Edgewood.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's like, yeah, one block over.
When you showed that, I was like, oh my God. So my great grandma bought that house, and I wrote about her in my poem, but like we lived in that house for 4 generations. So that's such a cool, diverse little neighborhood. And like Nuna's Fruit Market, my best friend growing up, their family owns it. Like, it's a cool spot.
Yeah, yeah, I love it. It's like it's to me, it's like such an interesting like in between of what Rhode Island is.
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah.
feel like I live kind of in these different like spaces of Rhode Island that feel very different, but I love both of them, and it's interesting to occupy these spaces. So
Yeah.
that's so, yeah, that's a very like Rhode Island connection too, to like
Yeah.
grow
I
up.
grew up a block away. Yeah. But thank you so much for talking to me.
Of course, here I'm going to put, you'll get this link in it's either week 3 or week 4, but that's the web series. There are 5-minute videos and there's 5 of them. So if you do feel like watching them in advance, you're welcome to, because I think they'll answer some of those questions and hopefully help with some of like the doubt you're feeling, of like the possibilities, to do this work, even if you don't yet speak the languages that your students speak.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Have a great week.
You too. Thanks. Bye.